All right, hello and welcome to section 5.2 of the CompTIA PenTest Plus training series. And in this section, we are continuing on with our post-exploitation module. And the contents of this section are going to be covering lateral movement techniques. So in the last section, we essentially covered what post-exploitation is and what lateral movement is. And we went through some of the basic frameworks and tools and strategies that are available to pull off such a feat. And in this particular section, we're going to be specifically talking about the techniques for lateral movement. So up until this point, up until module 5, right, we've done everything for setting up the rules of the engagement, for doing a good amount of reconnaissance and enumeration, and then we did some vulnerability scanning so that we can find vulnerabilities on the systems that we found during our recon and enumeration. And then after that, in section 4, it was all about exploitation and attacks. And so far, it was the longest section that we've covered. And I think it's going to be the longest section that we've covered because section 5 or module 5 has 4 sections. And then after that, we're going to go into the lab exercises and all the practical scripting and all that good stuff. So in this particular section, we're going to be talking about lateral movement specifically. Now, this is the process that attackers use to navigate through a compromised network, expanding access and gaining control over additional systems. This is a crucial post-exploitation phase in pen testing and advanced persistent threat operations. This is a very big key term here. APTs are very prominent in the world of pen testing, not even pen testing, I would say hacking in general, black hat hacking, like malicious hacking. APTs are typically sponsored by countries or individual states that have a lot of funding, and so they can put a lot of money behind the teams of hackers that they employ. And those teams of hackers, their entire job is to persistently, meaning over and over without stopping, to continue to attack an organization. And we've looked at the attack map before. And if you just Google cyber attack map, you'll be able to find a live map of all of the attacks that are taking place in real time across the world from different countries to each other. And it's a very, very eye-opening type of an experience. And a lot of those things are happening by APT groups. And if you go to the MITRE attack matrix and the MITRE attack framework, you will also find a lot of IDs or a lot of, we can call them usernames or group names, whatever it is, but it's basically like APT14, APT53, APT whatever. So they don't have an actual name. They just know the people from MITRE that have collected this information. Those people know that there are groups that are making these types of attacks, and these are the techniques that they're deploying, but they don't have any kind of name for them. So they just give them a basic ID of APT and then fill in the number. So APT groups are a very, very big deal. And they also exist in white hat hacking or pen testing, ethical hacking. And the entire purpose or entire goal behind an APT is to deploy lateral movement techniques so that they can stay in the network and go from one machine to the next, one user to the next, and ideally get themselves to a position where they can escalate their privileges and get the highest level of privilege possible, because that does the most damage. So this type of attack or this type of technique allows the attacker, being you and me, allows us to steal credentials, escalate privileges, and pivot through a target environment while remaining undetected. That part is really important, because if you're detected, none of this really matters. So the whole idea here is to remain undetected and to move laterally. So if you think about lateral movement being side to side, and vertical movement obviously going up and down, you want to move laterally until you can find a path to move vertically upwards and increase your privileges. So there is vertical movement, there's lateral movement, and at the very least, you want to move laterally piece by piece until you can find that path, until you can find the vector that you can use to increase your privileges. In this particular video, we're going to be covering pivoting and relay attacks, service discovery for lateral movement, LOLBins, also known as living off the land binaries for lateral movement, and then of course, as everything else, we're going to have tools for lateral movement that will make these processes a little bit easier for you. For example, Covenant, CrackMapExec, Impacket and Metasploit. Metasploit is one of these things that will show up and it's already shown up so many times. So Metasploit is, again, one of those tools that if you just learn to master it, it will allow you to do so many things. And this is no different. So this is it. This is what we're going to be talking about for this specific video. And I'm really excited to go through it, as with everything else, because we're just getting further and further along, and we're almost towards the end of all of the lectures, and we are going to be getting to our practical portions of this training series, where we actually start creating scripts and doing labs and using Metasploit to attack machines and using Nmap and just all of the cool fun parts of pen testing. We're literally almost right there. There's going to be 5.2, 5.3, 5.4, and then boom, we're diving into all of the practical exercises. So really excited for you. A quick little note from Hackaholics Anonymous and how you can get access to this lecture document, as well as all of the practice questions and the scripts and everything that we're going to create, and then we'll dive deep into the content. To get the PenTest Plus notes, practice questions, and to join a supportive community of like-minded people like you, consider joining the Hackaholics Anonymous membership community. We have 4 tiers: the supporter, the agent, the guardian, and the master. And each tier gets their own Discord server and early access to content. The agent, guardian, and master levels will get exclusive content like line-by-line code explanations for how to create cybersecurity and PenTest Plus scripts, like exclusive downloads that they will get. For example, the notes document for this PenTest Plus and everything that I'm using for the lectures, as well as all of the practice questions and everything else that will go along that will be made for the scripts and everything else that we're going to be doing for the PenTest Plus training series. There will be free pre-made monthly Python automations that have to do with system administration, cybersecurity defense, as well as, of course, PenTest Plus and ethical hacking. And then there's going to be monthly live streams with me every single month, plus so many other things that you would get as a part of being a member of Hackaholics Anonymous in these tiers. To join, you can simply click the link in the description below, or you can go to our homepage and click the join button there, or you can go to youtube.com/@hankhackshackers/join, and you'll be able to join Hackaholics Anonymous. Now, without further ado, let us continue with PenTest Plus. Okay, let's talk about pivoting. So pivoting and relay attacks go hand in hand, and pivoting is the technique where an attacker uses a compromised machine as a stepping stone to reach other devices within the internal network. So you've gotten into one machine inside of the network, right? Now you have access, technically, ideally, you have access to the whole network. So, or at least that network subnet, that network segment that whatever machine you're in has access to. So the idea here is to go from the machine that you're in and take yourself into another one of the machines inside of that subnet, and hopefully through any one of those other machines you can potentially find another attack vector to increase your privileges or pivot to another portion of the network. This is the tool Bloodhound. So Bloodhound we've talked about several times already, especially through the exploitation videos. The Bloodhound tool is where it comes in. Like, this is where it shines, and its whole purpose is to map out the path that you can take to pivot from the machine that you're in to another one and another one and another one, and ideally increase your privileges along the way and get yourself to that, the what is it, the homeland? Is it the homeland or glory? What is it? I forget the phrase. I'm literally drawing a blank right now. But it'll get you to the motherland. It's not the motherland. Gosh, I forget what it is. But it's basically the end goal, right? It'll get you to the domain admin. That's kind of the entire purpose behind Bloodhound, is to pave that path for you, to actually show you what you can do and which machines that you need to hack into, which users you need to hack into, to finally end up at that final destination where you have the highest level of privileges. So pivoting falls into that, right? So once you've used Bloodhound and it's shown you the path, then you pivot from the machine that you're in to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, until you land at that final location. If an external attacker breaches a perimeter system, they can use it as a pivot point to access internal non-public systems. So external attacker is you, right? When you breach a perimeter system, when you actually enter the perimeter, then you can use that specific system as a pivot point to access internal non-public systems, and often performed through SSH tunnels, proxy chains, or VPN pivoting, essentially saying any of these tactics could get you in, and then once you are in, you can then use another version of this. So you can SSH into a system, basically. Once you're in, you can then use a tunnel to go from one to the next, or to use proxy chains, or to use VPN pivoting, and just take yourself from where you are to the next machine and pivot from one location to another one. There are several types of pivoting. So we have network pivoting, meaning routing traffic through a compromised machine to access internal resources. So you are routing traffic through the machine that you have hacked, right, through the compromised machine to access internal resources. And then we have port forwarding, mapping a port from the compromised host to the attacker's system. This could be just another way of saying that you're creating a reverse shell for yourself, where you have one port that's being, you've connected a shell to that one port, and then from there you are forwarding, mapping a port from that compromised host to the attacker's system, right? The idea is, unlike a reverse shell, the port forwarded, the port that has been forwarded, will maintain that connection for you, and you won't have to have a live shell running all the time. If you do, that's whatever, that's fine. If you can maintain that shell without them detecting that remote connection and eventually kicking you out, that's okay, and that there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that you need to account for the fact that at some point they'll find you, they'll find that you have a reverse shell connection, and if they do, or when they do, they're going to terminate that session. And if that's the case, you need to find another way to get back into it, because they will most likely also block your IP address, and they'll do a bunch of different things to patch those systems. And this is where all of this, everything that we're talking about, is to mitigate for that, because if once they catch what you did initially, they're going to try to prevent it from taking place again, and you have to find another way in and repeat your whole process, or you will ideally deploy any of these tactics and give yourself a persistent way in. Then we have the SOX proxy tunneling, forwarding traffic dynamically via a proxy server. So again, another one of these things that assuming that you have that initial connection and you've set up your infrastructure, digital infrastructure, meaning your proxy chains or proxy servers, and you have access to those proxy servers, and you're tunneling the connection from your IP address to the proxy address and then to the victim, and then vice versa from the victim to the proxy to you, so that in case they catch the IP that's connected, they block the proxy, they don't block you. Right? So this is where that actually becomes very handy. So in order to prevent your actual IP address, your machine, from getting blocked and blacklisted, if you're using a chain of proxies, then what they're most likely going to see is that initial proxy IP address. They're going to block that one, and then you have another one and another one and another one, and you can just keep adding proxies. So the proxy between you and then the next one, and then the next one, and then finally the victim, usually it reverts back. So let me actually show you a visual. I think it's easier to just do a visual to kind of explain this a little bit. Okay, so here is the visual. This is, I mean, the pictures do really tell 1,000 words. So this is us, right? The attacker being us. We have these various services and servers that we can connect to. And then this little legend at the bottom will actually say a lot. So the initial compromise through RDP brute force, lateral movement, ransomware deployment. So these are just some of the examples of what's going on over here. So the initial compromise, which is just one, right? There's just one solid line, which is going from us to that initial compromise server. Now, this server is in the same subnet as all of these other devices. And what we have the potential to do is to go from this location to this one or this one or this one. And through each one of these connections, we can potentially connect to everything else. So if this server right here, if this server connects to this one up here, this down here, and this red one right here, then if we get to this right here, which has the potential to connect to these two and to connect to that one, then we're moving laterally, right? Any of these connections that we're making here are lateral movements. Now, let's say that between the attacker and this piece right here, instead of you going a direct shot right here, let's say we have two other circles here, and those two circles that are in the middle right here act as the proxy server. And the one that's closest to this connection right here, the one that's right next to this one, when the defensive team looks at it, what they're going to see is that there's a connection coming from this circle, the one that's closest to it, and is connecting to it. So they'll block this one, okay? They'll block the one that's closest to it, which means the next one right here, that's sitting right here, will be the only one that's left in this chain. So what will happen is, ideally, what you would do is, since this one is the next one that's left over, that will be the one that is connected directly to this one. So it'll move closer in this section, and then you can just add another one between you and that proxy server. And then you can repeat that process essentially as many times as you want to really establish a chain of proxies so that they never get a chance to find you directly. And this is where tunneling or proxy chains and all of these things actually really serve their purpose, is to prevent you from being noticed. And one of the greatest things that attackers can do is use a proxy chain. So one of the proxies is going to be in Germany, the next one is going to be in Italy, the next one is going to be in China, the next one is going to be in Iran, and the next one is going to be in whatever, Bangladesh, like pick a location, you know what I mean? There are many proxy servers, and this is one of the things that is actually really cool when we think about it. So let's go to free proxy servers. That's all you got to do is just Google free proxy servers. And then there is Go proxy. There's also the GeoNode proxies, which is literally, look at this list. There's a list of thousands of servers that are available here. Let me just minimize this. This is very annoying. We have all of these servers that are, and these are all free servers. And so what you can do is pick any of them. Usually what I would do is pick the one that has the lowest latency. So the ones that are quickly connected to, or 87.1 seconds versus 1 millisecond. That's insane, right? That's like a very big dip. And it just so happens to be that one is based in the US. That's hilarious. But I mean, there's a lot of other ones that are in the US that are super fast as well. So it gives you the protocol that's on there. So SOCKS 4, and you ideally want SOCKS 4 or SOCKS 5, which are the higher level. And then you can have HTTP. This is in Iran. Look at that. What else do we have over here? I mean, the countries themselves are very many of them. So there's Korea, there's, I think, BD, I think would be Bangladesh, I think. I'm not really that good at that. Great Britain, Vietnam, Spain, Deutschland, which is Germany. There are just very many of these. So these can serve as your intermittent or intermediary, I should say. These serve as your intermediary connections. And so you can have as many of them in your proxy chain as you want. And then from there, it becomes very difficult to track back to you, because the more that you have, the harder it becomes. And then, being who I am, I would choose all of the countries that immediately raise a red flag. Because if I choose Iran, for example, and if I choose, Russia, if I choose Russia, Iran, or just think of all of the countries that are on the OFAC list, or all of the countries that are on kind of like the UN list for being the countries to watch. When you pick those things, anytime that somebody sees the IP address and then tracks back to it, and you could go crazy and you could have like 6 Iran IP addresses and 5 China IP addresses, and then 4 Russia IP addresses. When you have all of those things, it just seems like, oh my gosh, we're being attacked by these series of countries that each one of them is a red flag. And it freaks the person out. And you could be sitting in the United States, or you could be sitting in the UK, and you're not necessarily in a malicious country. It's just that you're using the IPs of countries that are quote unquote malicious. And those specific countries, each one of them will just raise a red flag, and it'll send the defensive team into a panic, and it will make it seem as if that specific country is attacking them. So if you have literally all of the ones, so let's see if we can actually filter this down, because now I'm kind of getting a little bit excited here. So, we have 3 China addresses over here. We have 4 from Germany. Germany is all good, though. Germany is not in like anybody's list right now. We have 4 Iran IP addresses, and Russia. We have Russia over here as well. So we have 5 Russia IP addresses. So if you take all of those IP addresses and literally just only choose those countries that always kind of triggers some kind of a panic in these other westernized countries, what happens is they are thrown off your scent. They will not be able to, at the very least initially, they will think that they're being attacked by these other countries. So they will not think about the fact that, oh, you know what, we're in the US and somebody in the US is attacking us. They will not think about that. They will be so worried about thinking about, is it China? Is China really attacking us? Is Russia really attacking us? And unless they're super advanced defensive people that have been in the game for a very long time and they're like, you know what, this is probably a proxy IP, unless that's the case, for the most part, most defensive people will freak out. And this will be one of the greatest things that one of the greatest psychological tricks that you can play on them. And you should, in my humble opinion, you should do whatever you can to psychologically mess with the people that you're attacking. And that would be one of the cooler things that you can do in your approach in lateral movement and pivoting. So let's look at a couple of commands that we can actually execute to pull some of these things off. So for example, if we wanted to do SSH pivoting to an internal system on Linux. So this is the Linux version of this. So you do SSH-D 1080 and then -N, which give it the name of the host as well as the user. And then you would use proxy chains, nmap, and then etc. So these series of commands create an SSH tunnel, and they scan the internal network via proxy chains. So once you have connected, so this is the connection of during SSH. So these are 2 separate commands here. So you have the SSH connection, and then from there you have proxy chains, and then this is essentially how you can use a proxy chain, right? So there's something called the proxy chains tool. The proxy chains tool has a configuration file. Inside of the configuration file, you can list all of the proxies that we just viewed, as many of them as you want, to be your chain of proxies. And then you would call on proxy chains once you've set up the configuration file. You would call on proxy chains, and then you would do your activity as normal. So just run nmap, right? And what this does is the connection of nmap, when it actually tries to do the scan and do everything that it does, goes through those chains of proxies. So if somebody's watching this on the defensive side, they'll see the first proxy from the bottom, then the next one, then the next one, then if they actually choose to follow that chain of connections, they will see all of those connections, and it will become overwhelming, honestly. And one of the other things that you can do to really secure this is you can get a virtual machine from AWS or from Linode or Google Cloud, whatever. Get a Linux virtual machine so that it's not even your IP address, it's the IP address of the Linux machine that you've rented. Get that, then connect that to proxy chains, and then run nmap. So even if they finally reach the very top of the proxy chain list, and then they connect it back to the IP address of the host, it ends up being a virtual machine that is not yours, or it's not your actual machine itself. And so if they block that address, you just go generate another one from the Linode or AWS or whatever. So you can really kind of make this an ironclad approach by just using a temporary IP address from a virtual machine, and then from there using a bunch of proxies inside of the proxy chain, and then you go ahead and do your activity. So this will create the tunnel, and then this will be able to run the scan so that you can scan the internal network. And another one is to use Metasploit's pivoting feature for Windows and Linux, and that specific module is post multi-manage auto route. And so this is a post exploitation module inside of Metasploit, and then you can set the session. So previously you would need to have an established session. So inside of Metasploit, you would use one of the other exploit modules to, let's say, launch a Meterpreter session that is the remote connection to the target. And then you would background that session. Then you would use this post exploitation module and then set the session feature of this, and then we'll really be talking about Metasploit in great depth. So I'm just kind of giving you an overview here. And or you could always, like, by the time that we get there, you can always go and review the videos on Metasploit, because there are several videos on Metasploit on this channel. So you can see what the initial connection is like, you can see what post exploitation is like, and how to background a session and then set the option for this module to session 1, and then finally run it, which will route Metasploit traffic through a compromised host, and it will act as the pivot for you. Moving on to relay attacks. So we have the server message block and then the NTLM relaying. NTLM is something that is for hash values. And so relaying attacks allows attackers to intercept and forward authentication requests to impersonate a legitimate user. NTLM relaying with a responder or the in-packets NTLM relay X, or responder and the NTLM relay X. So we have the responder connection for the interface of ETH0, and then we have the NTLM relay that looks at the target's text file, meaning a list of IP addresses in that text file, and then it runs the SMB2 support option. So this will intercept NTLM authentication, the hashes that are assigned to NTLM, which is a Windows-based authentication hash, and it relays them to gain access, right? So if we want to look at this a little bit deeper, we can always go to our friendly AI, starting with the responder command. So the command responder-i ETH0, etc. is used to launch a responder. It's a popular tool for network pen testing, often used to respond to name resolution requests on a network and trick targets into providing their credentials. The command breaks down as follows. So this just calls on the responder tool. This is the interface. So this specifies the network interface to listen on. In this case, it's ETH0, which is a common name for primary Ethernet network adapter. You would replace this with the name of the network interface that you want to use. So this is the one that you're listening on. And then the --LM enables the capture of LM, LAN manager hashes, in addition to the default NTLM LAN manager hashes. While LM hashes are considered obsolete and are rarely used, this option ensures that you capture any legacy systems that might still be using them. And this is verbose. So -V is pretty solid across the board with like all of the tools that we end up using on the command line. -V always stands, or I should say like most of the time, it stands for verbose mode, which provides more detailed output to the console. So this tells the responder to listen on the interface, capture both LM and NTLM hashes, and provide that detailed feedback on the screen. Then we have NTLM Relay X. So NTLM Relay X targets SMB2 support, is used to launch NTLM Relay X, and this is a tool for NTLM relay attacks. It intercepts the NTLM authentication requests and relays them to another server to gain access without ever having to crack the password. So the first portion just calls the tool, right? The next one specifies a file, so the targets file, that contains a list of target machines to relay the NTLM authentication to. This allows you to target specific hosts for the attack rather than a single machine. The target's text file should contain one IP address or host name per line. So TF here stands for target file, and then we give it the list of targets, right? Then we have SMB2 support, which enables support for the SMB2 protocol. By default, the Relay X only supports SMB1. Many modern systems use 2 or 3, so this flag is crucial for ensuring the attack is successful against contemporary Windows environments. And the way that you would find out whether it's SMB 1, 2, or 3 is through your reconnaissance. So we are at the stage where we're assuming that you've done a good amount of recon, and you know that you're attacking the SMB protocol, and you also know the version of SMB that is being used. So that way, when you launch your final attack and then you launch your post-exploitation strategies, all of those things are being done against the right version of the protocol, the right version of the service or the system that you're attacking. This is very important because SMB 1 versus 2 or 3, as you can imagine, version 2 is more complex than version 1. Version 3 is more complex than version 2. So this is very important. I don't think I can say this enough. You need to spend a good amount of time sharpening your axe, which is doing reconnaissance and doing enumeration and really finding out the details before you start swinging the axe. As the old adage goes, if you have 4 hours to chop down a tree, you spend 3 hours sharpening the axe. The mitigations against these types of attacks would be to disable NTLM authentication and enforce Kerberos, which is the more advanced, more complex version of hash-based authentication, which isn't even really authentication through hashes anymore. It's through tickets that grant other tickets and tickets that grant access to services. And so it's ticket generation versus using hashes to authenticate. So that would be a really big thing right there. Then we have using SMB signing to prevent tampering, and then restricting admin access to necessary hosts only, which is always a really good idea. This falls under access control and the rules that you establish for your environment. So this is probably the best way to do it. And then you can go ahead and implement all of these other ones. And from the perspective of the attacker, if you are doing your recon and you notice that they have Kerberos enforced on their machines, you would move towards Kerberosting and the various attack vectors that we have for breaking Kerberos instead of focusing on NTLM, right? So these are, again, it just helps you hone in and get a really specific target in mind when you're launching your attacks and your techniques and tactics. All right, moving on to service discovery for lateral movement. So what is service discovery? This is something that you should have spent a good amount of time on when you were in the recon and enumeration stage. So attackers must first identify valuable services and accounts to move laterally in a network. Now, this is actually, you know what, I need to correct what I just said. So there is the initial service discovery that you would use for your initial compromise, for your initial way in. And then once you are in the network, once you've compromised your first host, then you would run service discovery again inside of the network. So my bad completely on that. However, I will say that once you're inside the network, you should spend a good amount of time doing recon inside of the network so that you can find the details that you would need to make the rest of your lateral movement, pivoting, and privilege escalation more successful. So the common services that are used for lateral movement are the SMB, the server message block, which is used for file sharing and remote execution. A lot of the things that we've done in Junior Pentester were for attacking the SMB protocol. So the SMB server message block is something that can be SSH'd, secure shelled into, and it can be used for file sharing and remote execution, and that would be something that you can jump into and then from there move along and pivot and do lateral movement. Then you have remote desktop protocol, the RDP protocol, which is the protocol that's used for remote login to Windows systems. This is kind of a really basic one. There are a lot of instances, most instances in any environment where RDP is actually being done legitimately. It's not a malicious thing. So therefore, if you can actually gain an RDP session, then you kind of just fall into the rest of the sessions. And unless you do some really blatant malicious tactics while you have your RDP connection, you're going to just go under the radar, right? And you can just do whatever you need to and do your recon. So this is actually very common. And then we have WMI, the Windows Management Instrumentation, that's used for remote execution. So you have the remote connection and then you have remote execution, which is, again, another one of those things that's actually very commonplace. So you could be under the radar. And then you have PsExec, which is the Windows sysinternals tool, which executes commands remotely over server message block. Now, as you may have noticed, this is all for Windows, right? You can actually use SMB on Linux and Unix as well, but these last three are actually very native to Windows environments because most of the computers in the enterprise environment are sitting on Windows. Unless you're attacking some kind of a server, which will most likely then be on Linux, because Linux is the common operating system for large servers. Unless you're doing that, then if you're attacking an individual host, there's a very good chance, like above 80%, above 90%, that it's actually sitting on a Windows machine. Once you are inside the device, inside of the network, inside of the host, I should say, you can then scan and enumerate all of the internal services using a tool like CrackMapExec. And so you could also literally run Nmap while you're inside of the subnet, inside of the network. But CrackMapExec scans SMB shares for lateral movement, and you can find it, or you can find these shares for lateral movement by running the CrackMapExec and then looking for SMB on the IP address. And so what you can see right here, this is the subnet that they've provided because that's the subnet that their host is in. Give a username and password, which would be the username and password that you have logged in as, and then you're scanning for shares. And this will list all of the accessible network shares for a user, meaning this specific user. And from there, you can see which of those shares have permissions that you can exploit. So for example, if they have granted every single person that can access that share full permissions, at that point, you can create an executable payload using something like MSF Venom, transfer that payload into that device, and use it as something that you can execute inside of that share because it'll give full permissions to any payload that's launched inside of the share. That's just one version of this. You could do so many things so long as the share gives you full permission. So you could, if you have full permissions, you can connect that share to your attacking machine. So this would be all be on the victim machine, right? So you can, from your attacking machine, connect to that public share. From there, you can create a bunch of payloads inside of the attacking machine, transfer them inside of the share, and then execute them on the victim computer. So many things that you can do. It's just once you have identified the shares, the very next thing would be to find the permissions for that share to find out whether it's publicly accessible and what you can actually do inside of each one of those shares. Another one would be to enumerate Active Directory users using the ImPacket suite of scripts. And so Python 3, because these are all Python scripts. So Python 3, and then just use the getAdUsers Python script, and then give it the domain that you want to be scanning, and then of course the actual local domain name. And from there, it'll find potential targets for lateral movement. This is very similar to what Bloodhound will do for you. So it all just depends on whether or not Python is installed on your target machine. If it is, you can use the Python version from ImPacket, or you can get Bloodhound and run that. So a lot of different things can be done. And if there is an accessible share, so this is where it all connects, right? So if there is a share that you've identified that can be accessed by the public, or you have enough access to that share where you can give somebody else access, then you would get the Python 3 script from ImPacket or Bloodhound or something like that. You can transfer those files into the shared folder, and then from the victim machine, access that same shared folder and then run those scripts. So it first starts with identifying a way that you can transfer the scripts into the victim machine, and then from there you would just run the scripts or transfer the tools, the payloads, whatever it is, from the target machine to the victim machine, and then from there go ahead and execute those scripts. So just depends on whether or not you can identify a share, and then going from there and executing the rest of your attack vector. Here's a way that you can do it using Nmap. So you can identify remote desktop protocol servers with weak encryption settings by using, first of all, this is the default port that's assigned to RDP. Then you can use a script inside of Nmap called RDP enum encryption, and then you would give it the subdomain. So the subnet, excuse me, my apologies. You would give it the subnet. So 192.168.1 is the actual network, and then you leave off the last one and you do the /24, saying that we are giving you the first 3 octets. So 3 times 8 would be 24. So we're giving you the first 3 octets. I just want you to scan everything in the last octet and then look for any RDP enumeration potentially that's available with weak encryption. And then that would be something that Nmap can do for you. You can do this internally once you've logged into the subnet that you're in, that local network that you're in, or you could technically even do it externally from your attack box and scan the machine. It's just that finding this IP address might not be available because it could be something that you learned when you got into the network and you scanned the internal network and you saw an IP address that previously was not available to the public. So when you run this from your own machine, from your attack box, you're essentially running something against all of the public domain names that would, or public IP addresses that would exist. And this IP address may not show up for you. So when you actually get into the network and you rescan and you find new IP addresses, then you can go ahead and repeat the process and see if there's anything that you can find with weak encryption settings. The mitigations against these kinds of attacks would be to restrict access to sensitive services. So for example, SMB or RDP or WMI, this is again access control policies. So if you actually do this, this is one of the strongest ways that you can mitigate against these types of attacks. And then on top of this, you can go ahead and implement endpoint security monitoring for unusual queries. You could actually have a list of queries that will set off special alerts that, you know what, somebody's trying to do internal scans inside of the network, or somebody's trying to do remote execution of some kind of a script, or somebody's trying to access a share and transfer a file to it. The file itself is a Python file. Python files are by default, they're just alert worthy. If you see somebody transferring Python files into your network, that's something to actually pay attention to. The current company that I work for does not allow the execution of Python files, and anytime that you're trying to transfer Python files outside by emailing it to somebody or emailing it to myself, for example, I tried to do this a few times. I created the file and I tried to transfer it out and the email service blocked it. And then I created the file from my own computer and I transferred it, tried to email it to myself at work. The service blocked it. So there are things that automatically just set off alerts, and they're red flags, and Python files in general are used for automation of certain tasks, and they're typically associated with creating scripts that can be malicious. So these are some of the things that are very simple policies that you can actually implement in your endpoint security. And of course, you have firewalls to block unnecessary lateral movement paths, which again, it kind of connects back to access control. It connects back to the concept of least privilege and all of the things that you should be doing as a security admin or a security engineer to prevent malicious activity from taking place by just blocking off things that are not necessary. So blocking off access to devices that are not necessary, blocking off access to services that are not necessary. All of these things are very basic things that can be done to protect the environment against malicious actors. And then we have LOLBins, so living off the land binary. So to really understand this, imagine that you've been thrown in the middle of a desert island, a deserted island, not a desert island, a deserted island, and you don't have any resources. So in order to survive, you have to try to find ways to live off the land, to try to find local resources that are on that island that can help you survive. And this is very similar to what we're talking about when we're talking about binaries that are available on that local machine. So LOLBins, living off the land binaries, these are legitimate system utilities that attackers abuse for stealthy execution and lateral movement. So these are actual binaries that the system uses regularly, or binaries that other legitimate users use regularly that can actually be used for malicious intent. but they're legitimate. They're actually legitimate binaries that exist on the system. It's just that if you have the wrong goals in mind, or if you have malicious intentions, you can actually use them to execute malicious intentions. And since these are trusted OS binaries, they often bypass security tools. So if you hack into a machine and you want to be as undetected as possible, this would be your approach: to use all of the binaries that exist on that machine to do your activities, and therefore avoid being detected by security tools, or avoid setting off some kind of alert from a security tool, simply because the fact that you're using something that already exists on that OS. It's a binary that is needed to do any number of legitimate activities, and it's been trusted by the operating system, and all of the security tools don't get alerted when any of these binaries are used. So if you use them, they're not going to be alerted, and then you can just do a number of things. So it requires more creativity from the perspective and the position of the attacker. So you have to know exactly what these things can be used for and what you can do with them to be able to execute your attacks. However, once you establish that, this would probably be the default approach, would be to try to use the local binaries on that machine to do the things that you want to do. These are some of the common LOLBins for lateral movement. So we have run DLL 32, WMIC, cert util mishta is how I like to call it, and then we have the reg server 32 as well. And so you can see that these are the abuse types of things, but again, as we mentioned, these are all legitimate binaries and the system uses them for legitimate activities. It's just that they can be used for abusive purposes. So let's talk about what that actually is. So this is our breakdown of these things right here. So we have the run DLL 32. So run DLL 32 specifies a dynamic link library file, and it executes a function from that specific file. And it's a fundamental part of the Windows operating system, used for a wide range of tasks, from displaying control panel applets to running actual system services. The abuse for this can be to execute malicious DLLs that have either dropped on the system or loaded from a remote source. For example, you can use run DLL32exe, which is the executable for that, and then run this specific malicious DLL to the entry point function, so to execute a function within their malicious DLL. This is often used for persistence, as the command can be added to the registry to run every time the system starts. And again, it's a legitimate binary. So if it's added to something for startup, it's not going to raise flags like that. Upon further investigation, they can find out that, oh, you know what, it's trying to launch this thing, which is a malicious DLL. So that doesn't seem right. But just by itself, this thing is not going to be an issue. Then we have WMIC. So the Windows Management Instrumentation Command Line is instrumentation command line. It's a utility for managing Windows systems and querying system information. System admins use it to automate tasks, collect data from remote computers, and manage system resources. Attackers can leverage WMIC for lateral movement and remote code execution. Since it's designed to run commands on remote systems, an attacker can use it to execute payloads on the machines within a network without needing to transfer a malicious file directly to the target. For example, a command like WMIC process call create and then give it the path to that executable could be used to execute a malicious file on a remote machine. So for example, again, so to understand this, you can use it to execute payloads on other machines within a network without needing to transfer the file directly to that target. Okay? So you're inside the network already, right? You're on a machine inside of the network. Now you want to run this on a different machine inside of that same network. So without having to transfer this executable to that machine, you can use WMIC to execute it on that machine. Then we have cert util. It's a command line tool for managing Windows certificate services. Its function includes managing certificates, CRLs, which is certificate revocation lists, and CAs, which is certificate authorities. Less known but legitimate function, and its ability to encode and decode files in base 64. So the file handling of cert util is what makes it a prime target for abuse. Attackers can use it to download payloads from the internet and decode them, all with a native Windows binary that security software might not flag as suspicious. For example, an attacker could download an encoded malicious file with a command like certutil URL cache split and then give it the file itself, which is this payload location, and then decode it with certutil decode payload exe, and then give it the output, which is again payload exe. It's just a decoded version of that. And it allows attackers to evade network monitoring tools that may only look for traditional file download. So certutil is again another one of those legitimate binaries that's used by the system or by the network to download certain things. It just so happens to be that we can also use it to download payloads and to decode the payload. So you could have it encoded so that the signature of the payload does not seem malicious, because a lot of times security tools, security appliances, they will look at the downloads that are coming into the system and they'll look at the signature of the download. And if the signature of the download is inside of a database of malicious signatures, then it'll block and delete that file. So if you encode it, then the signature does not appear to be what it used to be, right? And then once you've downloaded it, you can then decode it and then you can use it for whatever you need to do. Then we have MSHTA. MSHTA. It stands for the Microsoft HTML Application Host, and it's used to execute HTML application, also known as HTA files. And these files are essentially HTML pages with scripting capabilities, so VBS script or JavaScript, used to create simple GUI applications. GUI is graphical user interface applications. So basically types of files that are used to create graphical interfaces. Now the abuse could be that we can use this to execute scripts from remote URLs. An attacker can create a malicious HTA file on a web server and use MSHTA to execute it directly from the internet. This is a common method for initial access, and it can be delivered via a phishing email and bypass application whitelisting. The command would look something like MSHTA and then just give it the link. That's basically it. It's not complicated at all. It's just, it actually tends to be very powerful. So you can actually put this command inside of an email via a phishing email, right? And then this command, if somebody clicks on or opens an application, opens a download, I should say. If they open a download, then what it'll do is that it'll launch this in the background and it'll download the file. And then the file that's downloaded will then go ahead and execute whatever command is inside of it, because it's an HTML application file. Excuse me, my throat just gave out. It's an HTML application file, which essentially runs pages with scripting capabilities. So there could be a script inside of this page, and then all somebody needs to do is open an attachment in an email which runs this command, which downloads the script, and then from there it executes the script. Then we have finally the reg server 32, a command line utility for registering and unregistering DLLs and active controls in the Windows registry. It's used by admins to ensure that applications can find and use the necessary libraries. And we can use this to execute a remote scriptlet file, often an XML-based file with malicious JavaScript or VBS script. And this technique is sometimes referred to as squibbly-doo. The payload is not an executable on disk, but rather a script that is executed in memory, volatile memory that can be wiped when you reboot the system. So it can be executed in memory by a signed Microsoft binary. This makes it a powerful tool for evading antivirus and EDR. And a classic example is regserver32, and then you give it this command to the link of the payload as well, and then the output of the DLL, and it tells regserver32 to execute a scriptlet from a remote URL. So all of these things are legitimate binaries that are regularly used by the operating system, and we're just using them in a way that has malicious intentions. So if you find out that these are the list of the binaries that are available, then you can go ahead and use any one of these things. And so I just want to show you what command you can run to find out find the list of all of the available binaries. To find all of the available binaries, you create a very simple for loop in conjunction with the where command. And the where command is basically something that you can use in a Windows environment to search for something. So it could be for A in the path text, do where A. So this iterates through each executable file extension, for example, exe, bat, cmd, and it's inside of the path text, and then uses where find to list all the files in the that extension in the path. So while this command can be a bit slow and produce a lot of output, it's a way to get a comprehensive list of what is available. You can then use a filter like find string to search for specific binaries from the list that we just reviewed. So you can do this, right? And this will look for everything. And then you pipe the output of this. So this is what this does. You pipe the output of that to the find string command. And then from there, you're now looking for run DLL32, WMIC, cert util, mishta, etc. And you can go ahead and just try to see if any of those things can be found. And there's a really cool version of this, or there's a version of this specific list that you can actually find all of the binaries that can potentially be used maliciously. And I will now give you that specific domain. There are many websites that you can actually use for this. The one that I rely on most is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. But again, you could go to VirusTotal. You could go to, there's this Malware Bazaar. There's a lot of different places that you can go to. MITRE ATT&CK framework, because of the fact that it's been used and proven that these things have actually been executed in real life, this is the one that I typically default to when I try to find something. But you could go to VirusTotal. There are so many different ways, again, that you can go to actually find this. Now, one of the ways that I do it is to just click on Show Sub Technique. So all of these things get expanded. All of these different fields are expanded. And then from here, you can then just do a simple Control F and then search for DLL, for example. And now we can see that there are 19 results on the page for DLL. So if I just click up, it'll show me. So the password filter DLL, network provider DLL, then we have just DLL in general. So if I just click on this one in general, it should take me to everything for the DLL. So side loading, search order hijacking, redirection, phantom DLL, DLL substitution, and then a bunch of different examples. And as we talked about earlier, you can see that there are all these APTs, these advanced persistent threats that don't actually have names. And then some of them, there's Aquatic Panda and all these guys, they've been given certain names. But for the most part, there's always a lot of different examples that just are assigned to an APT. And so HTTP malware variant and port 22 malware variant using a legitimate executable that loaded the malicious DLL, right? So this is the types of stuff that you'll see. It's been known to side load DLLs with a valid version of Chrome with one of their tools. Ran legitimately assigned executables from Symantec and McAfee, or McAfee, I guess, which load a malicious DLL. So again, all of these things, right? You can see these things that they have all the examples of DLL files that have been used. It's DLL file into legitimate signed Java, used DLL side loading to give DLLs hard-coded names and placing them in search directories. So many different examples of this. And you can just keep searching through the database, right? You can search through all of these attacks and then just find these variants on here. So the next one that we can go to, for example, would be network provider. Then we have run DLL32. Look, it's actually even listed here. So this is actually under the system binary proxy execution, where you actually have reg server 32, run DLL32. You have Mishta that's on here. You have control panel, CSMT. So many different things that, again, we just saw on our list of DLLs that were used, but you can just go ahead and find individually, okay, what did they do with this? How did they execute run DLL32? What are the different procedures that have used it? And how can I learn from them? And there are literally dozens of these things, because this is a very popular vector, because it's a system binary that already exists. So if you can use it maliciously and it exists, then you should definitely do that, right? So this is just one resource. There are very many other resources. I just love this resource because on the MITRE ATT&CK website, you can just find so much information with breakdowns of how all of these things have been used and potentially how you can use them. So here are a couple of examples here. We can execute a remote payload with WMIC using WMIC and then giving it the target IP as the node. Process call, create a PowerShell executable, and then execute and invoke expression and a new object, web client, download the string, etc. So this whole thing right here is just executing a command using WMIC, and that command is creating a PowerShell instance, which is now going to execute a download of this specific shell script, which is the PS1 script right here. And now you have executed a remote shell payload or a remote payload with WMIC, and it PowerShell script on a remote machine. That's basically what it does. Now, using PsExec for remote command execution, so PsExec, and then give it the IP address, the username, and the password, and then just launch a command terminal, which will then go ahead and do that. So it gains a system shell on the target machine, assuming that you actually have the correct admin and password combination. So these are just a couple of examples on how you can actually use legitimate binaries to launch commands that can potentially be malicious, right? So if you have the admin username and password, you could do whatever you want with that. So you can do PsExec instead of doing RDP, for example. And then same thing over here. If you actually have a malicious PowerShell script that you can download and launch, then you can go ahead and just run this command, this full command right here. This is all one command. You would run something like that and then just replace this with the domain access of your specific script wherever it's sitting, and then it would get downloaded and it would be executed, and there you go. The world is your oyster, as they say. So the mitigations against these types of things would be to restrict the execution of binaries with application whitelisting, so App Locker or WDAC, which can essentially whitelist certain applications that can use it and then blacklist everything else that cannot use it. So default deny, essentially, so or default restrict all of the applications that should not be able to use it. And then from there, you can have a handful of applications that are allowed to use it. And same thing with the users, right? Or the user accounts that if they don't need to be downloading anything remotely, if they don't need to be executing anything remotely, then those things should be restricted for most users. And then you just give access to the administrator users that should be able to do those things. And then you have monitoring the process execution for suspicious remote activity. And this is just another one of those things that is like standard. It's very straightforward, but as you're doing your endpoint monitoring and as you are setting up your monitoring rules of what triggers alerts, those would be the things that you would account for, that anytime PsExec is launched or anytime WMIC is launched, there should be a series of alerts that pop up, because not very many people, again, should have access to executing a remote payload with WMIC. That's not something that all users need. So if it does get launched, if somebody uses WMIC, then you should be notified of it and you should track down who the user is that's executing that command. Was it something that they did intentionally? Was it something that we need to worry about if that user has been compromised, etc.? So if you restrict the execution of these binaries to individual applications and individual hosts and individual users, and then you can still see that these things are being executed inside of your monitor logs, then you can really hone in and be like, okay, is this legitimate? Who's the user? Okay, great. Are they actually on vacation or are they here? They are here. Okay, great. Are they in their office? Let's see if we can send them a quick little message. Are you trying to do something? Okay, great. And then you can verify those things. And then the other thing is, like, are they supposed to be in the office? Are they on vacation? Oh, they're supposed to be on vacation. So why is their user profile launching WMIC, right? Really simple stuff. It's not complicated to like reverse engineer these types of things. It's just that you need to make it as low of noise inside of your logs as possible. So when you do the restrictions against most users and most machines that just don't need access to this because it's not a part of their day-to-day. So when you do that restriction, then it shrinks down the pool of users that can use it. And from there, it makes it easier to monitor those activities. All right, so let's look at some of these tools. We have Covenant, CrackMapExec, Impacket, and of course, Metasploit. Covenant is an advanced lateral movement via a command and control server, or a C2 framework. So it's an open source framework that enables stealthy post exploitation, and you can deploy it very simply by running a command like this one. So for example, Covenant being initialized, then you want a listener on an HTTP protocol port, and then you just give it a port number. So for example, port 8080, which establishes a command and control listener for compromised hosts. And that's basically it. And this is something that you would be launching on your machine, I believe. So this is being done on the attacking machine because you have a C2 listener for compromised hosts. It could also be done reverse as well. So this is essentially just another way of launching a shell or launching a listener for a shell. It's just that when the connection for this has been established, it gives you access to everything inside of the Covenant framework, all of the tools and everything that you can use. So you can use it for moving laterally using the remote execution elements, uses PowerShell remoting to execute commands on other machines, and injects memory payloads to avoid disk forensics, which is, again, memory itself sits inside of the volatile memory, the RAM of the machine, and that memory gets wiped every single time you restart the machine, or if the machine crashes or power goes out, something like that. So injecting it inside of the memory to avoid disk forensics means if somebody actually gets access to this computer, they find out that this computer was compromised, and you want to avoid detection, you force the computer to shut down. And once they restart the computer, they're going to scan the disk. They're going to make an image or a copy of the disk itself, which is the hard drive and everything that's been stored on that computer. And then they're going to go through all of those things to try to do their investigation. So that's called disk forensics. Now, if you're operating inside of the volatile memory, the RAM memory, then what's going to happen is that once you force the computer to shut down, because you can do that using remote connection. If you have a remote connection, you think that you've been detected, right? You think they're on to you, basically. You just run a command to shut down the computer. Once you do that, then everything that was inside of that memory gets wiped. And then now the investigation team has to rely on what's on the hard drive, what's on the actual disk to execute their investigation. So this is what Covenant is very, very good for. The next one is CrackMapExec, which is an automated lateral movement tool which automates the SMB exploitation and credential reuse attacks. So for example, brute forcing SMB credentials across a network using this command right here. So very simple. So you have the CrackMap, you're using SMB as the protocol that you want to exploit. You give it the subnet of the IP addresses that you want to use, and then you give it a list of users as well as a list of passwords, and so it will go through every IP address in this subnet using every single one of the variations, the combinations of these users and passwords to try to find weak credentials for lateral movement, basically. And it can also help you map out the various machines that you can potentially hack into for lateral movement, etc., etc. So we've already covered pretty much what CrackMap does in earlier portions of this video, but this is just another one of those tools that helps automate that process for you and even actually do the brute force of the entry, the brute force of the login to try to find whatever credential combinations that will match for any of the IP addresses inside of a given subnet. Next one is Impacket, which is the Python toolkit for network attacks. And Impacket has a bunch of scripts in it. So this is not something that's just limited to one script. The one that we talked about earlier in this session was not the SMB exec Python script. They have a lot of different ones, and they're all very, very useful. So this is a toolkit for network attacks, and you can use it to execute remote commands via SMB, WMI, Active Directory. I think the one that we used earlier was the Active Directory get AD users, maybe. So to execute remote commands using SMB exec, you would use Python 3, right? You have to call on Python to be able to run a Python script, and then you would give it the attacker or user at the IP address, and then just let it run. So it executes remote commands via SMB without dropping any files inside of that computer, which is again really good for avoiding the disk forensics if and when they actually catch on that they've been hacked and they block it off, and then they want to go ahead and investigate as to what happened. And finally, we have Metasploit, our favorite framework. I love Metasploit because, again, it can do so many things. It has thousands of modules inside of it for enumeration, for reconnaissance, for exploitation, and post-exploitation. So this is a post-exploitation module, or this one specifically I don't think is actually post-exploitation. This is just a regular exploit. If it starts with post, we can say that it's a post exploitation. So this specific one is just a regular exploitation module that uses PsExec to hack into the server message block. So you would first use the module, meaning you just want to activate it, and you use this command to do it. And once you've activated it, one of the options or a couple of the options that are required options are the remote host, which is the IP address of your target, and the local host, which is your specific attack box's IP address. Now, typically, this is already preset when you launch Metasploit from your actual attacking machine. So this one usually will be preset for you, but it's just a required option that you need to set. Or you could just change the IP address to another IP address that you want to use for the connection to this remote host. And then you just do run. And then it executes a payload on a remote Windows machine via SMB, and ideally will get you a remote shell or a Meterpreter shell that you can go ahead and use Metasploit, including all of the options inside of Meterpreter, as well as all of the options inside of that target machine, all of the command line options inside of the target, as well as all the options that are available inside of Meterpreter. And then you can do whatever it is you need to do. And if you wanted to, you could background this session and then use a post exploitation module inside of Metasploit to go ahead and run a variety of different exercises. So very, 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 very cool tool, very powerful tool, extremely functional, a lot of different options available, literally thousands of them are available inside of Metasploit. And it just so happens to be the framework that most attackers will actually rely upon. And if you had to choose one tool, if you had to choose one framework to master, in my humble opinion, it would be Metasploit. And that brings us to our practice questions for today, which are all on lateral movement techniques. So a couple of disclosures as I always go through these things. These are not the exact questions that you will find on the PenTest Plus examination. We are legally forbidden and prohibited by signing the NDAs. So anytime that you take any kind of CompTIA examination, the first thing that you do before you enter the exam is you sign a non-disclosure agreement, which you're basically agreeing that you're not going to share any of those questions. You can share the concepts, you can try to share a variation of the questions, but you can't share the exact question. So that's number one. Number two is my goal here is to show you how to think and how to approach these questions so that you can use your own critical thinking abilities and process of elimination and all of those things to come to the right answer. It's not going to be a set 100% every single time you're going to get it right. But if I can teach you how to approach these questions, then I think that would be the best thing that I could possibly do for you. The next thing is I have not reviewed these questions in advance. I will be looking at these questions in the same manner that you're looking at them. When I created this slideshow, I copy-pasted all of the questions and answers in here, and I did not sit there and study every single one piece by piece because I don't want to come into this having memorized all of these things, because I would like to go through it and show you what my process is like to try to find the answers. And finally, we have a variety of different question types. So there's going to be multiple choice questions where you just choose one option. There's multiple response questions where you will get multiple options, so 2 or more options that you would have to select. And then there's going to be scenario-based questions, and then there will be lab-based questions. And the lab-based questions, I'm going to share all of those things with you throughout the labs. So there's not lab-based questions inside the slideshow, but when you get to the lab videos where we actually start doing a lot of practical exercises and doing scripting and all of those things, then you can learn how to answer the lab-based questions in those videos. In this particular one, we're just going to go through multiple choice, multiple response, and scenario-based questions. Okay, that being said, let's look at the first one. What is the primary goal of lateral movement in a pen test? Is it to directly exfiltrate sensitive data from a target environment, to expand access to additional systems within the network, to crash systems for denial of service testing, to escalate privileges on a single host? So let's look at the question. It says primary goal. First and foremost, we want the most primary goal, okay? The second thing is, which is the most obvious answer? So to directly exfiltrate sensitive data from the target environment, That could be a goal that you would do at the end of it all. That could be like the ultimate objective that you have. But the primary goal of lateral movement is not that. Is it to crash the system for denial of service? That's not true. So think about it like this, right? If it's in a pen test, if you're doing a penetration test, your goal is never to crash a system because it would affect the business that hired you to do the work, and it would be an incorrect thing to happen. Can it happen accidentally? Yeah. But your goal of doing this is not to crash the system. So keep that in mind. The primary goal of this in a pen test is never to crash a system. So just keep that, right? Is it to escalate privileges on a single host? That's also not true because we're doing lateral movement. So the idea is to expand access to additional systems within the network. Which tool is most associated with conducting pass the hash and relay attacks during lateral movement? So this requires that you understand what all these different tools actually can do. So Hydra is a brute force / password attack kind of a tool, and we use it mainly for online attacks where you want to log into a website form and you have a list of usernames and a list of passwords, and you want to use Hydra to brute force the login into that login form. So this is not conducting pass the hash and relay attacks, okay? This is an online tool. Then we have Wireshark, which is a network monitoring tool that allows you to do granular inspection of packets and frames. So this is also not a tool that's used for passing the hash and relay attacks. Then we have WP Scan at the bottom right here, which is for WordPress. So it's an enumeration tool to scan WordPress websites and try to find subdomains, folders, to try to find users, etc. So also not a tool that's used for pass the hash and relay attacks. The only one is CrackMapExec that actually fits the bill here, and that would be the answer. In lateral movement, pivoting is best described as, so what is it? You're pivoting from one machine to the next. Remember, it's essentially going from one machine to the next to try to find the final position where you would get the most privileges. So launching a phishing campaign from inside the network, using a compromised host to reach otherwise inaccessible systems, moving stolen data through covert channels, performing brute force attacks on multiple hosts simultaneously. So launching phishing campaign is not it. That's just a completely different topic. We're not doing anything that has to do with phishing when it comes down to pivoting. You can potentially find credentials for pivoting using phishing, but this is not the best description of pivoting, right? We're looking for the best description. Moving stolen data through covert channels, also not it. Performing brute force attacks on multiple hosts simultaneously, also not it. So you're using a compromised host that you've already logged into to reach otherwise inaccessible systems. That these are the systems that are not publicly accessible, right? So you found one host, you got into that one host. From here, you scanned the internal network and you found other hosts that are usually not publicly accessible. So now you're going to pivot from your compromised host to those otherwise inaccessible systems. Which Windows native binary, also known as living off of the land binary, is commonly abused to copy files or execute code remotely? So LOLBins, right? So remember, if you can recall the list of LOLBins that we looked at, and this also, that list that we looked at is not the full list of binaries. So that's another thing to just keep in mind. It could be any of these things, for example. However, if we want to look at a living on the land binary, so something that is pre-installed and it comes native with the operating system, Mimikatz is not one of them. SQLmap is also not one of them. These are things that would have to be installed on the computer. So it's definitely not C or D. Mimikatz is for password dumping. SQLmap is for mapping out the databases, the relational databases. So we have one of two things. We have PsExec and then we have PowerView exe. And PowerView exe, I want to say, is also something that is not a living off of the land binary. I think this is also something that would actually be installed. So the only one that is pre-installed that comes with the machine would be the PsExec. Excellent. Okay, cool. Which lateral movement tool is open source, .NET based, and provides C2 capabilities similar to Cobalt Strike. So Cobalt Strike is something that we talked about in the last video, which is a C2 framework, but Cobalt Strike is actually a paid C2 framework. So Bloodhound, no. Bloodhound is something that I mentioned several times in this video, but this is something to map out the path of users and machines that you can hack into to escalate your privileges and end up as the highest level privilege that you can find. Beef is the browser exploitation framework, and Nikto is something that is used for enumeration. And so Covenant would be the one that we would end up using in this particular case that would be similar to Cobalt Strike. Excellent. Which of the following are common techniques used in lateral movement? Pivoting through compromised host, pass the hash relay attacks, SQL injection attacks, ARP poisoning. And I feel like I'm looking at questions that we covered in the last video. So I want to double check and make sure that these are actually the questions for this section, because it feels like we're repeating questions here. So hold on one second, please. Let me verify the questions. Okay, these are actually the questions for this section, because of the fact that in the last section we also talked about lateral movement and we're looking at a lot of similar types of concepts. It just felt like we were repeating the questions, and I just wanted to make sure that I did not do a disservice to you. So this is actually a unique question for this section. So we're good in that regard. Okay, so which of the following are common techniques used in lateral movement? So pivoting through compromised hosts, that would be one, yes. Pass the hash relay attacks, that would also be one. SQL injection is something that's done on a web application or a website. So this is not one. This is a structured query language. So this is basically when you're trying to hack into a database by doing malicious types of SQL queries. So that's definitely not it. And then we have ARP poisoning, which is for address resolution protocol, which is for network type of enumeration and attacks. And ARP poisoning, so address resolution protocol, works with MAC addresses and the connection of MAC addresses to IP addresses, and then trying to poison a packet with your own data and change the MAC address to your MAC address so that the network allows you to enter the network, something along those lines. But it has nothing to do with lateral movement, right? It's mainly for that initial compromise. So both C and D are irrelevant, so it would have to be A and B. Excellent. Which tools are most appropriate for lateral movement operations? So 2 again. So Nessus, Impacket, Metasploit, and Nikto. So Nessus is a vulnerability scanner. So this is not for lateral movement operations. It's just a vulnerability scanner. It's a very advanced vulnerability scanner. It's a great tool. However, it's irrelevant to this topic. Nikto is for enumeration and finding potential vulnerabilities on a web application. So again, this is not for lateral movement. Impacket is a suite of Python scripts that is used for lateral movement, and Metasploit is, one size fits all. It can do everything, including lateral movement. So most appropriate for lateral movement would be Impacket and Metasploit. Which of the following best describe how attackers abuse LOLBins for lateral movement? Select 2. So again, living off of the land binaries, right? These are the binaries that are pre-installed and are available on the operating system, and they're legitimate and they're involved in legitimate operations. So how can these things be abused? Executing commands remotely without introducing external binaries? Sure. Leveraging trusted system binaries to evade detection? Yes. Performing SQL injection against web applications? Completely irrelevant. Encrypting network traffic with TLS tunnels? Also irrelevant. So SQL injection, we already talked about it. It has to do with a web application, and you would be using malicious queries, malicious SQL queries to try to get access to database data. Encrypting network traffic with TLS tunnels seems more like a security thing, but it could also be to cover your tracks, for example. So if you have a remote connection to a compromised host and you don't want them to see what you're doing, you can actually encrypt the traffic between your attack box and that compromised host so that they don't see the commands that you're sending back and forth. So this can actually help to cover your tracks. But again, we're talking about something that best describes how attackers use binaries, the local binaries for lateral movement. So this doesn't really have anything to do with that. So executing commands remotely without introducing external binaries, yes. And then leveraging trusted system binaries to evade detection, also yes. So A and B. All right, scenario. A pen tester compromises a Windows workstation that sits inside a segmented network. So this is not something that would be publicly accessible, I would assume. They discovered they cannot reach the database server directly from their machine because it's not public, but they can access it if they first pivot through the workstation. Which lateral movement concept is the tester applying? Relay creation, service enumeration, pivoting, credential dumping. I mean, the answer is inside the question. So they can't reach the database, but they can access it if they first pivot. So, the obvious answer in this particular case would be pivoting. It's definitely not credential dumping. We're also not doing service enumeration necessarily here. We're compromising a network workstation or a Windows workstation that's inside a segmented network. And there's really nothing in this question or in this scenario that says we're looking at a service. And we're not really relaying any kind of credentials here. But we are talking about pivoting from one machine to a next. So C would be my answer. You are testing a financial institution. After compromising an Active Directory user account, you attempt to authenticate against multiple machines using their NTLM hash without cracking it. That is a relay right there. So you use the NTLM hash without actually cracking it. You're relaying the hash. So this technique allows you to move laterally within the domain. What technique is this? This would be pass the hash for sure. Kerberos golden ticket attack has nothing to do with NTLM, because if you're using Kerberos tickets, then they're not using an NTLM system. They're not using NTLM protocols. They're actually using Kerberos ticketing protocols. So this is irrelevant to the question. Reverse shell persistence is also irrelevant to the question. It could kind of be it, because technically what you're trying to do is you're trying to establish persistence. So you're authenticating against multiple machines to try to get into lateral movement and try to find other access points. However, this is not a reverse shell persistence that's being described in our scenario. And we're also not doing injection inside of the lightweight directory access protocol. Lightweight directory access protocol is typically what access permissions are available for the users inside of that protocol, or inside of that network, I should say. Or not even a network, inside of that host, inside of that machine. Maybe the network, like the domain. There we go. Domain is a good word. So lightweight directory access protocol has to do with the access permissions that are available to people inside of that domain. And if that's the case, this is also irrelevant. So the only thing that we're talking about is passing the hash here, the NTLM hash, without cracking it. That's what we're doing. There we go. During a pen test, you use in-packets WMI-exec Python to execute commands remotely on multiple machines inside a corporate network without copying malware binaries. Okay, this is an example of exploit customization, LOLBins, cloud exploitation, SQLI-based pivoting. So SQLI-based pivoting, so again, it's SQL injection. And I don't know if we can even do SQLI-based pivoting. I feel like this is like not even a right. I don't think this exists as an answer anywhere. I don't think pivoting exists from SQL injection. I could very well be wrong, but I don't think this is even a legitimate answer anywhere. Now, cloud exploitation is also not relevant here because we're not doing anything inside of the cloud. We are doing something remotely, which can potentially imply cloud or people connected to a cloud, but we're not doing anything inside of a cloud environment. We're just doing multiple machines inside a corporate network without copying malware. So I don't think that's even relevant. Exploit customization can potentially be the answer, but I would have to convince myself to use that as an answer, that we're saying, okay, we're going to use this exploit and we're going to customize our attack, etc. So the only thing that really makes sense here is, number one, WMI. So WMI is one of those local binaries that exists inside of a computer. And so we're doing WMI-exec and using the Python script for in-packet to do that kind of an attack. So it would be a local binary, living off of the land binary that we're doing. Excellent. Your red team engagement involves exploring network defenses. You use Metasploit to discover open SMB shares and escalate to remote code execution on a secondary host. You then configure port forwarding through that host to access another segment. Okay, so red team engagement, exploring network defenses. You use Metasploit to discover open SMB shares, and escalate to remote code execution on a secondary host. You then configure port forwarding through that host to access another segment of the network. Which two techniques are you applying? So service discovery, pivoting, credential spraying, Kerberos ticket forging. We are not forging any kind of Kerberos tickets, so that's not the answer. Exploring network defense, you use to open SMB shares. So that would be service discovery. I would say that's pretty solid. We're also pivoting. We're going from one host to another segment. So I think that's another answer. Credential spraying is not something that we're doing. There's nothing here that actually implies that we're spraying credentials. Credential spraying is basically when you have a dozen different usernames and one password that you're going to end up using. And so you try to use all of those usernames with one password to see if any of them are going to hit. That's kind of what credential spraying is. So we're not doing that here either. The only thing we're doing is we're discovering a service, which is the open SMB share. And then we're pivoting from one segment to another part of the segment. So it's A and B. Excellent. And with that, we have wrapped the section 5.2 practice questions. That was actually not bad. That one I kind of felt a little bit more confident on. And I think it was a nice way to go through those questions. Hopefully you were able to also come along with those answers and you were able to follow my train of thought, my logic behind finding those answers. And for the next week, we're going to be talking about data exfiltration and staging. And then after that, we have section 5.4. And then after that, we're done with all of the lectures. And then we're going to be going through all of the practical exercises with CompTIA PenTest Plus, which is something that I've been waiting for throughout this entire thing. I just personally, for myself, I just want to keep practicing more hacks and more actual tactics and scripting and all that good stuff. So super excited to finally get to the end of this whole thing and share all of that with you. If you have any questions or comments about what we talked about today, please drop them in the comments section below. And of course, as always, if you want access to these practice questions and if you want access to the notes document and all of the scripts that we're going to create, then please make sure that you consider Hackaholics Anonymous. You're going to get a quick message about that real soon in the next few seconds here. And finally, if no one else loves you, Hank loves you, make sure that you like, subscribe, share, and drop that notification button so that you get notified the next time that an episode comes out here. Love, peace, and chicken grease, and I will see you in next week's episode later. To get the PenTest Plus notes, practice questions, and to join a supportive community of like-minded people like you, consider joining the Hackaholics Anonymous membership community. We have 4 tiers: the supporter, the agent, the guardian, and the master. And each tier gets their own Discord server and early access to content. The agent, guardian, and master levels will get exclusive content like line-by-line code explanations for how to create cybersecurity and PenTest Plus scripts, like exclusive downloads that they will get. For example, the notes document for this PenTest Plus and everything that I'm using for the lectures, as well as all of the practice questions and everything else that will go along that will be made for the scripts and everything else that we're going to be doing for the PenTest Plus training series. There will be free pre-made monthly Python automations that have to do with system administration, cybersecurity defense, as well as, of course, PenTest Plus and ethical hacking. And then there's going to be monthly live streams with me every single month, plus so many other things that you would get as a part of being a member of Hackaholics Anonymous in these tiers. To join, you can simply click the link in the description below, or you can go to our homepage and click the join button there, or you can go to youtube.com/@HankHacksHackers/join, and you'll be able to join Hackaholics Anonymous.